Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Dalbo Rohaj and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by
Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington University.
On our podcast, we talk about the challenges to European peace and security that have erupted along a line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. Our special guest today is Brigadier General Carsten Rasmussen, retired from the Royal Danish Army. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. General, it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast, and I suspect there are many different topics we will want to cover during the course of this episode. But perhaps one way of getting into this conversation is to pick up on your experience as a former defense attaché with the Danish embassy in Moscow. So we've been watching the Russian military in action for over a year now in Ukraine. In many ways, the Russian military underperformed the expectations that observers had and the sort of assessments that had been made by experts before the war. Were you surprised by anything in particular during the course of this war when it comes to the Russian military performance and its inability to adapt, its inability to really sort of perform as one would expect the second largest military in the world to perform?
I'm a senior fellow at the Institute of Military Analysis. It's a very new institute in Denmark. We have retired Danish officers, but we're also a Norwegian officer, a Finnish officer on board now, and we try to make ourselves relevant in the Danish and Nordic debate about defense and the future of, or the development of our defense in the future. I was indeed surprised by that. I would say first, I was not surprised at all that Russia invaded Ukraine. There was a reaction in Europe and in the West in general that this came as a surprise. It did not come as a surprise. It had been brewing for a long time. We could see the build-up. It was pretty clear that something was going to happen, although we didn't know the exact date. And when it comes to the performance of the Russian army, I was indeed surprised. I'd expected them to perform better than they did. I had expected them to go through a deeper and a more thorough planning at both the operational and the tactical level for the operation that they undertook. And I couldn't imagine that the Russian army would enter into such a big operation in a peacetime establishment. We saw Russian unit passing the border to Ukraine on a peacetime establishment with only a 60-70% manning, which is completely inadequate for a major offensive operation as they launched.
So do you think that this is mainly that the errors were mainly due to planning? And we've heard the rumors about the Russian army having their ceremony uniforms around the idea of 3 days to take all of Ukraine. So bad information and bad planning. Or was it also to some extent, maybe less so for you with ample military experience, but for most of us across the West that are looking kind of from a civilian perspective, was it also that we had built Russia into something more capable than it was due to disinformation, propaganda over many years, trying to tell us in so many instances, from their use of drones just before the war to their military reform and their efficiency in military operations over the last few years, that they actually weren't all that powerful and effective as we were telling ourselves that they are.
Yeah, they fooled us, but I think more importantly, they fooled themselves. They started this war overconfident that they could win the war within just a very, very short time frame. They thought that that they would meet a weak enemy, the Ukrainian army, and they were simply overconfident that they as I said, with a peacetime establishment, with poor planning that did not go all the way from top to bottom before this operation, that they could simply roll over Ukraine just in a matter of a few days or a matter of a few weeks. So they managed to fool us into believing that they were stronger than they actually proved to be, but they also fooled themselves.
And if I can ask just a follow up question based on your experience as defense attaché to the embassy of Denmark in Moscow, this was at the time of the full scale invasion, right? You were there, you watched the full scale invasion from Moscow. So can you tell us what your personal experience was, how you felt? How did Moscow feel in those days from that kind of unique position?
I got up early in the morning on the 24th of February 22 for reasons that men in my age have to get sometimes to get up a bit early in the morning. I checked my telephone and found out that President Putin was going to deliver a speech on television early in the morning, before 6 o'clock or around 6 o'clock in the morning. Um, I watched this speech with the disbelief, horror. He's actually going to do it. Not that it came as a surprise, but anyway, so now it's the real thing. I couldn't really believe that. And then Moscow changed a lot during the first couple of weeks after the invasion took place. Where Moscow was a very pleasant, or in many ways, a very pleasant city to live in 2019, 2020, and up to the invasion, things changed a lot the first few days. It felt more, you felt the control, you felt the police was there. You felt the Rosguardia was everywhere. Patrols on the street started to check people's ID, check particular young people's mobile phones, cell phones, check what they had in the bags, and Western companies started to close down their shops in Moscow. So just within the first couple of weeks, the whole atmosphere of the city changed quite a lot.
Can you tell our listeners how long you were in Russia after the invasion?
I was in Russia till the beginning of April, where I was ordered back to Copenhagen due to my possibility to continue my work in Moscow was simply exhausted at that time. I was under very close surveillance by Russian security people all the time, and as a matter of fact, the last few days I had to stay in my apartment. I couldn't leave the apartment. So at that time, it didn't make any sense for me to continue try to work from Russia.
I should at this point tell our listeners that we've been joined by our colleague Giselle Donnelly over from the UK. Giselle, it's great to have you on the podcast with us.
It's just glad to be with you. I'm glad to be with you, and I apologize for timing us.
And I think you are going to enjoy this one because there'll be a lot of talk of tanks in particular. But before we get to tanks,
let's get to it.
General, I wanted to ask you about one topic that is on everybody's mind right now, which is the Battle of Bakhmut, which seems to be the largest, bloodiest battle of this war. In which both sides seem to be suffering extraordinary casualty levels. And there's this sort of debate about whether President Zelensky should withdraw, shouldn't withdraw, is the mistake, how much Bakhmut itself matters. Do you have any views on the sort of the state of the play on the ground as it presents itself today on the 10th of March?
I'd say the Battle of Bakhmut does not matter itself. It's not. The geography of Bakhmut does not make it a strategic important city by any means. It's not a railroad juncture. It's not important. There are no important infrastructure in Bakhmut. But the Battle of Bakhmut matters because the casualty ratio right now still appears to be very much in Ukrainian favor, where the Russian loses between 5 and 7 soldiers every time the Ukrainian loses one. So it's a very cynical game that's taking place in Bakhmut, but it's to the Ukrainian advantage to continue to attrit Russian forces in Bakhmut while they are probably preparing for an offensive later this spring. So therefore, it still makes a lot of sense to stay in Bakhmut as long as the Ukrainians are able to do that. But as the map look right now, we are getting closer and closer to the time where I believe the Ukrainians will decide to withdraw from Bakhmut itself.
If I could just ask a follow-up question about that. As a tactical analysis, and certainly as an operational analysis, and maybe even a strategic analysis, I would surely agree with what you said. But it is so curious that the Russians keep banging away at this. They must value it in a way, maybe domestically, politically, and maybe Mr. Prigozhin will make some hay out of this as an internal political power struggle. Just trying to look at this through Russian eyes is first of all just very difficult to do. But given the investment that they continue to, and the manpower that they continue to throw away in the most sort of capricious manner, it makes me wonder just what the heck they're thinking and whether we can deduce something from the price they seem to be willing to pay for a somewhat pointless victory.
I believe that the Russian plan was then at the beginning of the winter to attrit Ukrainian forces and also to attrit the Ukrainian society. And that's the reason why we've seen these bombing, missile, UAV campaigns against civilian infrastructure, against energy infrastructure throughout the entire depth of Ukraine. And then at the same time, the Russians tried to wear down the Ukrainian forces on the front line. And for whatever reason, beyond my comprehension, Bakhmut suddenly started to get a huge symbolic value for the Russian. Suddenly, for the Russian side, suddenly Bakhmut was so important to win the battle in the Donbass, to seize Donetsk, to seize Luhansk. And as the battle, the symbolic importance of the battle increased for the Russian side, it also started to increase for the Ukrainian side, because now it also became a symbol of Ukrainian resilience.
At the same time, moving away slightly from Bakhmut, but still looking at the battlefield, the conversation continues on whether the West is giving the Ukrainians enough to win or just enough to barely make it to survive. And we've seen that through particularly the lens of the leopards, freeing the leopards over the last few months. And as we are speaking, training of the leopards has started. I think when we're looking at Poland, they just declared that their training has already been finalized as being on some of the first to open up training for the Ukrainians. And you, General, have been driving leopards, including Leopard 1s, particularly in Bosnia in the 1990s, in the first half of the 1990s. So can you tell us how is it to drive a leopard, first of all? Second of all, what do you see in terms of the challenges in training for leopards? How difficult is it or easy? And do you think that with the reduced number that we have overall as the West promised of tanks compared to what the Ukrainians have been asking for, a minimum of 300 when we have just the first ones arriving now, what difference do you expect Western tanks, older Western tanks, to be making in the next few months in Ukraine?
Actually, can I just add one thing to that list? I think it would be useful to explain to people what the difference in the generation of the tanks is between the Leopard 1 and the Leopard 2, which would be analogous to other the differences between other generations of Western tanks. Why is the Leopard 2 superior to Leopard 1?
Before I start to talk about tanks, I think I'll talk a little about of the support that we have provided from Western side, also from the Danish side in general to Ukraine, and then I can talk about tanks for an eternity after that, if you allow me
You're
to.
very welcome to.
It's all, it's all electronic. We can go on forever.
Super, super. In general, and I'll use Denmark as an example to illustrate how this has evolved out over time. The support for Ukraine. Denmark has during this past year provided support for approximately 1 billion US dollars in total, 700 million in military support, and the rest humanitarian direct financial support. That makes Denmark rank as number 10 among the countries that delivers military assistance to Ukraine. And the total value of this is now in direct bilateral support. It's 0.22% of our GDP, and if we include the support that we provide through the European Union, it adds up to 0.47% of the GDP. So it is, although Denmark is a very small country, is still a substantial support. The way it has evolved over time was that just before the invasion started, our chief of defense was asked by the minister to figure out what we could support with of non-lethal support, and that was I believe it was on the 7th or 8th of February last year. But after the invasion started, that quickly changed. We started to consider first to deliver lethal support to the Ukrainians. We took things that we had readily available in our warehouses, like light anti-tank weapons in the beginning, then Stinger air defense missiles, spare parts for Stinger missiles, and then there was a discussion, actually there was no discussion. Then suddenly we delivered Harpoon anti-ship missiles that were used by the Ukrainians in the Black Sea. And then we had this discussion that had been there in so many countries over time. Where are the red lines for the support that we can provide to Ukraine? And we gradually realized that there were no such red lines. So, starting from light anti-tank weapons and air defense missiles, we moved forward to provide older APCs, M113 APCs. We entered into a joint venture with other nations to produce some Susanna 2 self-propelled artillery pieces. They were produced by Slovakia. Then we donated an artillery battalion of brand new Caesar artillery pieces that we had just purchased from France. They didn't even make it to Denmark. They were redirected to Ukraine immediately. Then the whole discussion about tanks started, and now the discussion is somewhere else. We're now discussing, should we donate F-16s? Should we donate aircraft? Should Ukraine have longer range precision weapons? So this has been a very incremental process where we have, how should I put it? We've gone from one meeting in Ramstein to the next meeting in Ramstein. And we've done that for a year now. We now come to the point where most of the warehouses in Europe, they are half empty. There's not much ammunition left. We've come to the point where it's really painful to give away more weapon systems from your own inventory, because we also have to rebuild our own defense capacity. So I think we are at a juncture now where we need to make some very tough decisions and start to produce what is needed, not only for Ukraine, but also to rebuild our own militaries and to fill our warehouses with the ammunition, the light weapons, and all the things that we pulled out of the warehouses over the last year. And let me now turn to tanks. When I was a young officer, served in tank units, Denmark had more than 300 tanks. We had 230 Leopard 1 tanks at that time. After the end of the Cold War, we really cashed in on the peace dividend and downsized the armed forces, including our tank fleet, which means that we're now down to, I believe it's only 44 Leopard 2s. So when the decision was made to donate tanks to Ukraine, to us, it did not make any sense to start to donate Leopard 2s. because we have so few. We had one squadron of 14 tanks deployed to Estonia right now. Another one is in the workup period, and a few tanks are coming out of Germany after being upgraded to 2A7. So if we decided to donate Leopard 2, we could probably have donated a platoon of 4 tanks to the Ukrainians, which would not make any sense whatsoever. Four tanks does not make any difference. Therefore, we started to look for other solutions. And we did that first with our German partners, then with our Dutch partners as well, because we knew that there were old tanks available in warehouses, not owned by governments anymore, but owned by private companies in Germany. We had 99 ex-Danish Leopard 1A5s in Flensburg, owned by a company called FFG, the Flensburger Fahrzeuggebaugesellschaft in German. And there were, I believe it was 88 ex-German tanks owned by Rheinmetall in another warehouse in Germany. So we decided to donate these tanks instead, of see what we could make of the more than 150 tanks that were in warehouses. And we made this joint venture, and it's ongoing now. The governments have bought back these or will buy back these tanks. The companies are making them ready for deployment to Ukraine. We are in the preparation phase of training Ukrainian tank crews or Ukrainian tank instructors. And at the end of this process, we think we will be able to donate at least 100, perhaps as many as 150 Leopard 1A5 tanks. And then I've heard some criticism say, "Oh, Leopard 1 is a very old tank. How can you donate this tank to the Ukrainian? Is it fit for modern battle?" And I would say, yes, it is indeed. The Leopard 1 tank is absolutely suitable for what's going on in Ukraine right now. The majority of the Russian tanks are older tanks. And as the war over time, we see more and more older tanks coming into the Russian formations. We now have seen, I believe, it's up to 800 T-62 tanks. They're 60-year-old. They're being prepared for combat and being issued to a Russian unit. Even the most advanced, the most elite tank units like the First Guard Tank Army, their new tank units are going into Ukraine with T-62. And then back to Leopard 1A5. The Leopard 1A5 is very superior to a T-62. It's even superior to some of the more modern Russian tanks. So of course it's not a Leopard 2. Of course it's not an Abrams. Of course it's not a Challenger tanks. But it can make a difference on the battlefield. And the philosophy behind this, it's better to have old tanks than no tanks, and it's much better to have many tanks than few tanks.
If I can ask just a quick follow up, apart from the tanks, you mentioned at some point that you think we are at a juncture, that 1 year plus into the war, it's a matter of production and amping up production on the continent in Europe as well as in the United States. We hear bits and pieces out of Russia, part rumors, part data based, about their challenges, but also their capacity of amping up production. So, how do you think this can go into the next 6 months to 9 months to even a year? Do you think that we will be able across kind of in the United West to amp up production to the level that we can sustain the Ukrainian forces? Or will we be in a situation with political changes in the United States, across Europe, with time, with people losing focus on Ukraine, basically disable the Ukrainians from winning, while the Russians go into this for the long haul and believe that time is on their side?
I believe the next few months will be very critical in this respect, because even though the decisions have been made in the United States and also in Europe to increase, for example, the production of artillery ammunition is in very short supply on the Ukrainian side, as well as on the Russian side right now. This week there was a meeting of the European Union defense ministers in Stockholm, where the ministers decided to enter in some sort of a joint venture and pool the acquisition of artillery ammunition, both to Ukraine but also to fill up our own warehouses again. But it's going to take time, because they have to set up new production lines, and they have to increase the speed of already existing production line. So I think the effect of the decisions being made right now in Europe and in the United States to increase production of ammunition, to increase the production of defense equipment in general, will not really kick in until late this year, or perhaps the beginning of next year. The consequence of this is that in order to continue to resource the Ukrainian military, we will have to take significant risk by continuing to take equipment, to take supplies, ammunition from our own warehouses, from our own armed forces, and make sure that the Ukrainians have whatever they need to defeat the Russians.
If I may, this is such an important point, because especially in the American discussion these days, there are just so many actors, many of them acting in bad faith, saying that the Europeans are not doing enough, and that this should not be America's problem, and why are we sending so much more assistance to Ukraine than the Europeans. So in your view, is there a sufficient sense of urgency in Europe? Is there anything that could be done beyond what is already being done, such as the common procurement scheme, such as we've heard reports of supposed plans by Rheinmetall to set up a factory, perhaps in Ukraine, producing Panthers for the Ukrainian military. Is there what are the sort of binding constraints that could perhaps be sort of relaxed, and where should sort of the sense of urgency come from?
There is indeed a sense of urgency in Europe, and the way you explained is, I think there's also some misperception, some misunderstanding on the American side about how much or how little Europe actually does. It's absolutely correct that as a single nation, the United States is the single biggest contributor, the single biggest donor nation. But look at what individual smaller European nations like Poland, like the Baltic states, how much they're providing if you compare that with the GDP. Even a country that like Denmark, and we're not in the top five, we're sort of around the 10th place as a donor nation. If you see how much we provide as part of our GDP, I think we outrank the United States in this. So there's indeed a sense of urgency in Europe. But we have the same challenges with our defense industry in Europe as I believe the United States have. We have not been producing defense equipment, weapons, ammunition for a large-scale war for many, many decades. And our production facilities, our factories are not up to speed yet. There's only one way we can get them up to speed, and that's by governments providing guarantees for the industry, and also that new investment needs to go into the defense industry to ramp up production of defense equipment as quickly as we possibly can. Let me use tanks as an example again. I love to talk about tanks, as you probably found out by now.
Hitting all my hotspots.
Yeah. And see, like a company like the German Krauss Maffei Wegmann, the producer of Leopard 2 tanks, currently what Krauss Maffei Wegmann is doing is upgrading older version of the Leopard 2 up to the 2A7, the newest version. That's what being issued to the Danish forces right now and to the German forces as well. They're not building new tanks, even though we know there will be a requirement for new tanks very soon. Norwegian government decided to procure, I believe, it was 57 new 2A7 tanks. There's also been a decision, as far as I know, in Italy to buy a substantial number of Leopard 2 A7, but they haven't signed the contract yet. And as long as they haven't signed those contracts, nothing is produced. That's where I think government needs to weigh in with guarantees and needs to kickstart the production. Because in reality, the companies would not take any risk by starting the production right now. There'll be plenty of customers out there before the tank roll off the production line.
Our listeners should understand that the situation in the United States is exactly analogous to this. I was at the M1 tank factory in Ohio not too long ago, and General Dynamics, which operates that plant, and it's a government-owned plant, has only lately been able to bring its workforce up to the required level simply to meet the orders that are already on the books. And to expand that line would just take a long time and a lot of money, and as you say, basically require a government guarantee that would be a worthwhile investment for the company to do that. But of course, if we could just also sort of turn the telescope around a bit. One thing that concerns me equally as what's happening on the battlefield now is what people believe the situation will be after the war, if we can just use that shorthand term, and if we can also assume that the Ukrainians are ultimately successful by their own definition. There will still be a Russian threat posed to Eastern Europe, and I just would be interested in your perspective on whether there's been a Danish Zeitenwende that really makes people grasp the idea that, geopolitical military competition has returned to the Garden of Eden in Europe, and just interested in your perspective on how both your countrymen and if you have a perspective on Europe more broadly, whether they've taken that point to heart or what they think about it.
And if I can add to that, to sort of take advantage of your presence here and nerd a bit about European defense, Denmark has been over the last year sort of flying under the radar because it's been flanked by Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO. But Denmark has joined over the last year European defense in the form of permanent structured cooperation. So can you help us also make sense of that? How do you understand this important change in the context of the last year and the war?
We do not call it a Zeitenwende in Denmark, but a similar process as the German Zeitenwende.
That's probably for the best. Yeah.
Well, it is true though. It is true though that the Danes had a much keener understanding of the Russian threat years before this full-fledged invasion. I remember conversations with my Danish friends back in 2014-15 that were qualitatively very, very different from what was coming out of Berlin at the time.
That is perhaps correct, but unfortunately, the Danes failed to act on this understanding. And and I'll go back a little bit. I mentioned earlier that Denmark had really cashed in on a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, and downsized our armed forces, disbanded our old conscription system, mobilization system. And then in the years after the Cold War, the Danish forces were deployed in all sorts of alliance and coalition operations in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, in the Indian Ocean, and so on. And in parallel with maintaining this very high profile in alliance and coalition operation, we disbanded many of our own defense capabilities. Based on an assumption, maybe a wrong assumption, that we would have at least a 10-year warning time before a direct military threat could reemerge in our immediate neighborhood. We had a glimpse of that threat back in 2008 when Russia attacked Georgia. I was a defense attaché in Poland at that time, and we did not, in Copenhagen, there was indeed not the same sense of urgency as in Warsaw. after the invasion of Georgia. The new threat became crystal clear in 2014 when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea and invaded two oblasts in eastern Ukraine. But despite that and NATO's decision at the Wales summit in 2014 to increase defense spending, we continued the downward trends in our armed forces. And the year after the Wales summit in 2015, Danish forces had a budget cut of 15%. And the consequence of this policy that I would claim was very naive was that when Russia launched the second invasion of Ukraine last year, the Danish armed forces were in an appalling state. We were underfinanced, undermanned, underequipped, and not fit for major high intensity fighting like what we saw in Ukraine. This was a wake up call for the government we had back then. And on the 6th of March, they made, with very broad support from Parliament, a decision that is comparable with the German Zeitenwende. It was agreed to increase the defense spending up to 2% of GDP by 2033. That was later changed to 2030. And at the same time, there was an allocation of additional funds, emergency funds for the armed forces. I would say the bulk of the emergency funds have been used on military support to Ukraine and not support to our own armed forces. But I think that's very fair because the Ukrainians need it more than we do. Then in late 22, we had general election, and that delayed the whole process for some months. And now we're entering into a phase where there will be negotiations on a new defense agreement. And during the discussions leading up to the new defense agreement, I think there's a very good chance that the end result will not be a 2% defense spending by 2030. It will be more than 2%. And I cannot put an exact year to that, but there's a discussion now that it should be more than 2%. And there's also in the new defense agreement, I think there's a very good chance that many of the capabilities that was disbanded in the years after the Cold War, like for example ground-based air defense and our reserve system, that such system and mechanisms will be stood up again in the next defense agreement. So there's a kind of a Zeitenwende that has been a kind of a Zeitenwende in Denmark as well as in Germany, but it has taken a long time. And I'm actually very surprised that it has taken so long to get up to speed. Just as I'm very surprised that it has taken a year before we seriously started a serious discussion on ramping up production of defense equipment and production of ammunition. We have been pulling stuff out of our warehouses for a year now, and now we finally start to discuss how this can continue. How can we continue to deliver what the Ukrainians need and at the same time fill up our warehouses again?
Well, that sounds almost like an cautiously optimistic note on which we might consider wrapping this session up.
We should stop now before we get dark again.
Let's do that.
General, thank you so much for joining us today. From Dalbor Rohaj,
Giselle Donnelly,
And Julia Sosa.
Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security challenges that have erupted along the line running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Many thanks to our special guest today, Brigadier General Carsten Rasmussen, retired from the Royal Danish Army. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag EasternFrontPod, written as one word. And don't forget to sign up for the Eastern Front's newsletter through the link included in the show notes to receive more content from the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Thank you, and goodbye.